All right, so we are back with the tier list. A lot of people have been asking for it. I also made one last season, and I have this niche category, as you see here. First thing we're going to do is delete it. And the main reason is because the main critique I saw was people didn't really like having a niche category. They kind of felt like they wanted to see where those niche things paired up with other weapons. So when I do get to them, I might give that explanation that they are a niche pick, and that's why they kind of sit in here, because when they're strong, but there are obviously certain things that aren't going to be strong in every scenario, and that is kind of the beauty of the finals. Everything has its place in certain situations. I'm also going to be using this weapon graph sheet that you can find on the Ape Squad website. It is made by Zafferman. He does a bunch of the gun data, breaking down the range, the TTKs, the damage. All this stuff is really, really important when comparing weapons, and it doesn't paint the full picture as to what is strong because there are a lot of other things such as accuracy, but it is a very, very strong bit of information to pull some of the logic as to why some weapons might feel a little bit stronger than others. So we are going to be comparing some of them a little bit here and there to kind of explain why they might sit in a similar category or while they just kind of don't compare. But there are a lot of unspoken things that you just don't see until you actually play it that really, really do matter. And this isn't everything, but it is a little bit of something. I'm going to leave a link below if you guys are interested in looking at this. Don't look at it as your Bible, but it is a fun thing to look at regardless. So let's start off with heavy. And first we're going to be looking at the Akimbos. I think this is an A tier pick right now. Akimbos are shining a lot more now that the SA12 has been nerfed. The LH1 has also been nerfed, so heavies actually have a little bit more freedom to play a little bit further range. And even then, a lot of people are really good at using this with winch and just landing headshots as you pull targets in. So this is actually a pretty solid pick right now, and it is being picked up a lot in EU. Now, when it comes to the meta, I'm mainly looking at the quote-unquote pro scene and high elo gameplay. And when we are looking at the pro league that is going on currently, this is actually being picked up a fair bit. The Akimbos are actually not too bad in the right hands. Next, we have Flamethrower. This belongs in B tier. There are certain players like Y Satan Y who is fantastic at using the Flamethrower, and honestly, without him, I probably would put this a little bit lower, but even then, when I've faced him, he is a threat. You need to respect your space when facing him, because he's able to juggle this with his mesh very, very effectively. I wouldn't sleep on it if you are a big fan of the Flamethrower, but unfortunately, I just don't see it shining enough to push it into A or S tier, but there are a lot of benefits to bringing a Flamethrower to your team. Next, we have the KS. Even though this got a buff, I would have wanted to see this in A tier, but sadly, I think it lacks a little bit because of a lot of the animation cancels that it got removed. The winch combos don't quite work as well, so unfortunately the KS just isn't really shining right now. The Lewis gun I think is in A tier, although I do think this is a bit of a bottom tier in A tier, but I think it is sitting here pretty nicely because it's still a relatively decent gun. And again, with some of the nerfs and buffs this season, the meta is sort of shifting away from that full-on shotgun meta, but there are some outliers that we'll get to eventually. But the Lewis gun is decent right now, and I think it compares quite well to the M60. I'm actually going to put the M60 ahead of the Lewis because I think the M60 is a little bit better than the Lewis, but the comparison is just so similar. So if we look at the weapons here, we can look at the M60 versus the Lewis here, and you can see the time to kill is very, very similar up close, and only at a further range do we see that the M60 starts to lose out a little bit. But other than that, the M60 kind of holds its own, but there are a lot of other benefits like having a bigger magazine, having that slightly faster TTK on some of the classes here, and being able to just fully spray this thing. Both of them are pretty accurate in the right hands, but I think the M60 is a little bit easier to use. So I do think it just has that slight advantage over the Lewis gun right now. Next, we have the MGL. I think this belongs in garbage tier. I'm sorry, Andrewstown. I want this thing to get reworked. Andrewstown has a fantastic idea for it to kind of turn it into a little bit like a TF2 weapon. So I want to see what they do with this in the future. But I think the MGL is a pretty fun weapon to use. But I think it could walk this fine line of, being either useless or overpowered like we've seen with some other weapons. So it's a little bit tricky to buff this thing, but as it stands right now, it does feel quite garbage. Next, we have the SA12. I think this is currently a lot better than some of the other picks right now, but it's not an S tier anymore. That nerf kind of set it back again. There's still a lot of players who can absolutely roll lobbies with this, so it is not dead by any means, but it simply just isn't as strong as it used to be. Next we have ShAK. I'm going to put ShAK a little bit ahead of SA12 simply because I think the ShAK is a little bit more accessible for most players. It's a little bit easier to use, and it does have some really nice TTKs. The only thing is that reload and the bullets that it has in the clip just kind of hold it back a little bit, but I think that's the trade-off to the power that you get from it. And like I said, with the meta sort of shifting a little bit away from shotguns, the ShAK sort of sits at that nice middle ground where it's actually pretty good up close, but that doesn't mean that it can't do something at range. So it kind of fills the gap where a lot of other weapons like Lewis gun and SA sort of specialize in certain ranges. Next, we have the Sledgehammer. This is also in A tier. I'm going to put this just behind the ShAK because I think the Sledgehammer is actually really, really strong right now. With the SA12 nerf, this was a significant buff to the Sledgehammer, along with the stun gun being removed at the moment. The Sledge has had a lot of free reign to just roll lobbies right now, and it's kind of nice to see a little bit of a mix between melee and guns. It's kind of nice to see a mix of melee and guns being viable within the meta, as long as things don't push too far past that viability into an overpowered territory, which I think the Sledgehammer kind of feels like when you do use an SA12, because the SA12 previously used to be able to kill heavies with 4 pumps and a melee. It no longer can do that, so the Sledgehammer just simply wins, which is kind of why it's above. Next, we have the Spear, so this belongs in C. I don't think this is garbage anymore, but I do think that it kind of fills that role of being a melee pick, but the Sledgehammer just kind of dunks on it in terms of its capabilities. It just feels like it's pretty far behind the Sledgehammer, and there are some things that are pretty cool about it, like the AoE that it gets. Sadly, this thing just isn't good enough to compete at the moment with the Sledgehammer. But overall, it's honestly not too bad of a pick, and I think if you spend a lot of time to master it, you can do some work with it. Next, we have the Minigun. This is actually going at the top of A tier. I think this currently is the best weapon on the class, and I want to give a big shout out to Busy. If you guys don't know him, he's over on Twitch. He has really shown a lot of the competitive players that Minigun is a fantastic pick. His movement with it is very clean. He moves around with the Minigun almost faster than I would see somebody move around with any other weapon. And considering it slows you down, it's very impressive to see that. But his aim with it, his ability to always have that uptime, I feel like every time he gets into a fight, he doesn't even have to spool the gun. It's just already ready. And he still has really good movement. So he's really been able to show that the Minigun is a very good pick. Not only that, but I do think it might be the best pick. A lot of other teams in the Pro League are slowly picking this up, especially in NA. I don't think EU has been infected quite yet, but over here in NA, the Minigun is doing really, really well, and it seems to be shining above a lot of the other weapons, but I don't think it belongs in S tier. It's not overpowered. I think it is in a pretty good spot here, and I've even seen some top players saying that it needs to be nerfed, so it is quite interesting to see where some of the weapons are at right now, considering what we thought of some of these weapons a little bit earlier in the season. But as it stands, this is kind of where the heavy weapons sit. Next, we're going to be looking at medium, and I think medium has had an interesting journey with some of the weapons in its class, as some of them have gotten some unwarranted nerfs, some of them have gotten some unwanted buffs, and we've just been in a pretty weird state of limbo between things that are overpowered and underpowered for some of them, while others just kind of push past that line, and others just fall so sadly. So we're going to get rid of niche again, and we're going to start with the AKM. I think the AKM is a pretty solid pick right now, and it goes in B tier. I think this is a really good all-rounder kind of weapon. I think the nerf that it got a while back was a little bit unwarranted, and that's kind of where, I bring up how medium weapons have been in a little bit of a weird state. They removed 4 bullets from the magazine, and I think those bullets should come back, but if they want to leave it at 32, maybe there's some other approach it could take. Maybe a very small RPM buff, maybe an accuracy buff, maybe a range buff. I don't really know what this gun needs, but it needs a little bit of love to be able to compete with some of the other weapons like the Cerberus here, which belongs in S tier. Yes, the Cerberus used to be a pick that a lot of people thought was kind of a joke, but we've seen after the buff, this thing can one-shot lights, it can 2-shot mediums, and it can 3-tap heavies. It is an absolute monster, and that fire tick is very, very strong. I think the consistency of this weapon is just unreal, and I think a lot of people can force a lot of fights with the dematerializer, which really suits this weapon. I think the Cerberus earns its spot in S tier, and typically NA is the region that only really kind of plays shotguns, and you can see players like Brendy absolutely stomp with shotguns, but we've seen it start to get picked up in EU, and it seems to be a pretty frustrating thing for EU players as well as NA, and when EU is complaining about shotguns, you know it is pretty strong because they love their ARs. They like sitting a little bit further back, whereas NA loves to use shotguns, it seems. So Cerberus at the moment is an S tier pick. Next, we have the CL40. This is going to go into C tier. Now, it kind of is garbage, and I debate putting it in there, but there are some use cases where I think the CL40 is not too bad, and certain playstyles that can be kind of strong, but they're pretty easy to counter, and for the most part, it is just not that good right now. But certain maps like Las Vegas, where you can force those close range engagements, it might be a little bit easier to use the CL40. Now next we have the dual blades. I think this belongs in garbage tier. I'm not a big fan of dual blades. I think they are really weak and they don't really bring a lot to the team. They're pretty easy to counter. There's no mobility on them. They just suffer in a lot of ways, so the dual blades is a garbage pick for me. The FAMAS is going to be our other S tier pick. Now the FAMAS is honestly just so strong after the recoil changes that happen with some of the sights, and this is where I think the gun is falling into a weird spot because I would put it in A tier if it wasn't for the recoil. The recoil on it is just so still, and it seems to be like the compact reflector, and the reflector is just good examples of how this gun basically doesn't shake and there's like no recoil on it. And some sights there's a little bit more wobble, so I don't really know what's going on there, but it seems with the certain sights, this gun just becomes an absolute monster. But I don't really know how to say if it is OP as the base weapon, simply because of the way that the sights are working right now. And I don't really know if the ones that are super still is the way that it's intended, or the ones that are a little bit wobbly are the intended one. We don't really know right now, so most people are just using the compact reflector at the moment. The FAMAS is definitely a very strong pick. It kills quite fast, and even though the TTKs might seem bad in theory, as we can look here, between the FCAR, the FAMAS, and the AKM, we can see that the FAMAS actually has pretty high TTKs in most scenarios. It looks bad on paper, but the thing about it is there is a burst delay. So whenever you have to deal with that burst delay, it adds a little bit of time to kill. But if you are able to land a headshot, you could instantly make this time to kill a lot faster. And that's why the FAMAS is so good, because if you are able to kill a little bit quicker than needing the burst delay, then the FAMAS just becomes a demon. So in the right hands, this thing is insane. Next, we have the FCAR, and this is a very solid pick. It is going in A tier. I think this is, in general, one of the better ones, especially on paper. As we see here, the FCAR looks great on paper, but in practice, it just seems to be a little bit behind the FAMAS. But I think if you are somebody who is really good at tracking and you have fantastic aim, the FCAR is a really, really solid pick. So I wouldn't shy from it, and I still think that this is a very strong pick in the meta. So definitely use the FCAR if you enjoy that. Next, we have the model. I'm going to actually put this in B tier. Now, I think the main thing that's holding the model back is the Cerberus. It's just completely outclassed by the Cerberus, and the FAMAS also is really good at close range with some of those time to kills that it gets and the fire accuracy. So the model is just kind of shy from that. But I feel like outside of a lot of those, one-on-one scenarios versus some of its competitors, the model still has a pretty good place in the meta when it comes to killing lights. And even killing heavies at a certain range, you can kind of play outside of their common ShAK or SA-12 range, or even the winch and sledge combos. The model still has a bit of a place there, but it just doesn't hold its weight versus some of the other contenders in the meta right now. So as it stands, the model is a B tier. Next, we have the Pike. This goes into A tier, and I think this is one of those scenarios where it is niche. And the reason why it's so strong is because there's certain maps like Suspended Structures, Kyoto, where this is just really, really dominant. There's so much you can do at range, and the time to kill on some of the classes is still phenomenal. It actually competes with a lot of the other classes just on paper, while also having really, really good range. Being able to 3-shot a light also is a very, very strong thing to bring in, especially if the light likes to sit back with an ARN, then you can just kind of beam them and deal with that light for your team. Next, we have the Revolver. This goes into B tier, and I think it is above the model, but not above the AK. I think the Revolver just needs a little bit of love. I think there is so much potential with it. There are some fantastic players that are really good at the model, or sorry, at the Revolver, but it just isn't enough to compete with stuff like the Pike. And it just kind of falls short in that category. Now, obviously on paper, if you just hit all your headshots, then of course it's good, but its range is quite bad. Hitting consistent headshots at the max RPM of the Revolver is unrealistic to consider everybody doing. So in a regular situation, in most fights, the Revolver is just simply not holding its own versus a lot of other weapons. And in the Pro League, we've seen a Revolver main do quite well. And even they swapped off the Revolver, and it was pretty sad to see. But everybody needs to conform to the meta when they are pushed to their limits. Next, we have the Riot Shield. So the Riot Shield is going to go into C tier. Again, I think this is better than Dual Blades, and there are some use cases like blocking your teammate stealing, and in general, you can block a lot of damage at range. So the Riot Shield's not the worst in very niche scenarios, but it's really hard to cater to the Riot Shield in every map and in every scenario. And even in the cases where it is really strong, oftentimes it might be better to just bring a heavy with a mesh shield, because at least the heavy can swap to something that can do a little bit more at range. And the time to kills obviously are not that good, so you don't really compete with a lot of other melees, as most melees just go through your shield, so you're not really beating anybody here. It's just a very niche and unique playstyle that you really need to play around on your team comp to make it work. Next, we have the CB01 repeater. And I think this kind of goes at the bottom of A tier. It's definitely not as good as the Pike, but the main reason that I find a little bit of struggle putting this in a category, because I almost feel like this might actually belong here behind the AK as well, but I think realistically it's in the A, is because sure, it is really strong against lights, but it's really weak against heavies, and versus mediums, it's kind of this weird middle ground where if you are really accurate with your headshots, it's really, really strong. It's actually extremely strong, but if you're not hitting your headshots, or if you're facing a heavy in general, the CB01 repeater is just very lackluster. And for that reason, it's kind of one of those niche scenarios where sure, bring it out when you have a bunch of lights in the lobby, but if you have multiple heavies, it probably isn't the best pick. But overall, you can make it work. And if you focus on killing mediums and lights first and not just focusing heavies, as this weapon isn't that good at it, then sure, you can make this work and you can really play to its strengths to be a pretty solid player for your team, but it just doesn't really hold its own versus some of the meta picks right now. Now, we are going to be looking at light, and light is a little bit tricky because there are certain playstyles that cater to certain weapons, and a lot of people might think something is really, really strong because it's really good in certain scenarios. And that is where it becomes really tricky to really grade some of these things, because there are certain things like the SMGs that tend to be good in most scenarios, but then there's also stuff that are like the melee or the shotguns that are good in specific scenarios and not really a pick to use all the time. So with that being said, I'm probably going to give some caveats to a lot of the picks here. Now we're going to start off with the 9.3R. I think this is a B tier pick. This is pretty solid, especially after the LH1 nerf. A lot of lights are kind of rejoicing because there is a little bit more versatility in what we can bring in and what is viable. And I think the 9.3R is shining a lot more than it was previously, simply because some of the other weapons have been kind of brought in line and you aren't so heavily punished for not using the meta. So for that reason, the 9.3R is a pretty solid pick right now because it is pretty good at killing mediums and heavies, but it really does specialize in killing lights. And with so many lights finally back in the meta, as we have HML as the dominant meta right now, we're seeing a lot of reason to counterpick the lights, because if you can kill the enemy light, then you basically win that fight. So the 9.3R is basically just targeted at doing that. I think there are a lot of other options that seem to be better for general pick and general use, but in specialty use and in niche cases, the 9.3R has a lot of reason to bring. So I think it is a pretty solid B tier pick. Next, we have the Dagger. Now this is going to go into C tier, and we're going to delete niche tier because I probably would put it there, but realistically, a lot of people don't want to see that. So we're going to put it in C tier. I don't think it is the best. There are certain people like Kale Whale and Lord Burb that I've seen absolutely stomp lobbies with the Dagger, but It did get an unwarranted nerf, in my opinion. I feel like some of the melees have not really had the best shine in the meta. Dagger's always kind of been slacking. There's only been two that I think have shined, which is like the sword and the sledge. I haven't really seen many other melees do anything in the meta, and the Dagger's just a little bit behind in that regard, so the nerf felt a little bit unwarranted, but a lot of the Dagger players just took it on the chin and they decided to keep playing their weapons, so I'm really proud to see a lot of them pushing through, and hopefully with enough asking for buffs and love from the developers, we can get a little bit more versatility for some of the melee weapons and not only cater to two. Next, we have the LH1. I think this belongs in the B tier, but I do think it is actually a pretty solid pick. I'm actually going to put it at the top of B tier, and the main reason is because when you are in maps like Yodo, Suspended Structures, we've been over this kind of before, where you're in these longer lines of sight. The LH1 obviously has a place there, but you really need to force those fights. Once you get into those building fights versus mediums and heavies, this thing just lacks, and it's just not that good. Next, we have the M11. This is going to go into A tier. I would rather use the M11 than the LH1 most of the time because I can use it as a kind of close range, just delete people, but there are other things that do it a little bit better. Actually, because of that, I'm going to move it to the top of B tier because there are some other picks here that I think belong in A tier, and I don't really want to put it there. But the M11 still has its place in terms of being able to do some stuff at range and mid-range, but there's not category where it seems to shine over anything. It seems to be just a little bit behind other things depending on how you're going to use it, if it's a close range or long range. So it does fill that middle ground, but there's also things that fill that middle ground just a little bit better. Next, we have the M26 Matter. This is an A tier pick. This is a really solid pick, and I think it is really underrated. The ability to break trees and zips is actually really important in high elo, and it's a big reason why we see Minigun dominate in high elo, because breaking trees, breaking zips, breaking walls, breaking all your lines of sight while holding a point is actually so strong, and a lot of people do not understand how strong this is. But say you're holding a point from a building and there is tons of trees in the way. Well, it's really difficult if someone just jumps onto that and starts stealing. You can't really see them. You need to force yourself to get closer over there. So with something like the M26 Matter, or in general just shooting trees, if you can break a bunch of those lines of sight that the enemies might use to block, then you and your team can shoot from range. The M26 Matter, of course, if you get a jump pad, you can just jump on them while your team shoots from behind. So the ability to be able to see the map more clearly is a really big plus for the M26 Matter. Next, we have the bow. Now I'm going to put this a little bit in the middle of B tier. I think that this is good in the right hands. There are players like Pharos who absolutely stomp with it, but even he is kind of using some of the other meta picks in the Pro League, even though he did use it a little bit in the beginning. I would love to see him use it more, and I also have played a lot of bow, and I know its strengths. You can one-shot combo lights, you can combo some of the other classes, but it really suffers versus mediums. I find mediums is really hard to kill with the bow. Heavies aren't too bad, especially because you can play at your range with dash and just keep chipping them down with big chunks every once in a while. And their DPS tends to be a bit slower, so you don't have to be up front taking a bunch of damage while you're full spraying. So I think the bow in the right hands is really good. The ability to not have to reload also means that you can kind of keep chipping at enemies over and over again. But I think the bow is a pretty solid beat pick. I would still like to see some buffs to it, but obviously I'm very biased. I think ultimately it does sit in a pretty fair spot right now, but you really need to master this weapon to be able to use it at a higher, more competitive level. Next, we have the SH1900. I'm going to put this just behind the Matter. I think it is really good, and it can be quite frustrating as it does basically two-shot everything and even one-shot lights. So you can absolutely delete people, but the reload does take a little bit. You don't really have that super lunge or whatever that you get from the sword, so it can be a little bit tricky to get into positioning, and it is kind of an all-in, and if you fail, you're kind of screwed. Usually you can only delete one person and not, clear out an entire room or a bunch of players that are playing on top of each other. So for that reason, it's like you have to be a little bit more accurate with it. It does suffer a little bit versus some other picks, but when you can land that, then it is really strong, and especially a lot of people who are good with dash can get in, get out quite effectively, but it does require a little bit of a very unique playstyle, and again, certain maps might not favor it. So again, this is a pretty solid pick, but not like a general pick, but I think in the cases where it is really strong, it is an A tier. but on some maps, it probably lacks a little bit, and it might be a even C tier on something like Suspended Structure. Unless you are an SH main and you just know how to manipulate every fight your whim, I think the SH kind of sits in a pretty strong spot here, but I wouldn't say it is necessarily S tier. Next, we have the Sniper. I think this is garbage tier. I'm going to say the only person that I really trust with this is like Alan K. Now, he's in EU, so I don't have to worry about him, but there's not many people really out there that can use the SR84 to a very high level, and even a lot of people don't really like to bring it into ranked, so it can kind of struggle a little bit there. Next, we have the Sword, which recently got a nerf. I'm going to put it in C tier. I think the nerf to 105 damage is probably not the best approach. I would have liked to see some bug fixes, like the Phantom Strike, I think was an exploit that I don't really want to see. The hitbox could be pretty janky at times, and I know that has a lot to do with netcode, but it'd be nice for them to kind of look into cleaning that up a little bit. There's also stuff like multi-hit that allowed it to take over. Stun being removed allowed this to get a bit stronger. Smoke, having 3 of them, just became a way for swords to play the Casho extremely effectively. So swords were kind of taking over in the meta, and the nerf might not have hit the proper pain points, but it was a nerf regardless. Next, we have the throwing knives. I'm going to put these at the bottom of B tier. I think throwing knives are honestly not that bad, but they require a lot of effort into mastering them, and they kind of play similarly to the Recurve Bow, where I think the throwing knives just can feel a little bit janky at times, and I think the fact that they have inaccuracy while in midair hold them back a little bit, but I could see them being a little bit stronger than some of the other picks if that got changed, but maybe it might become OP again. And I know a lot of people do not like throwing knives being overpowered, and I think this, like the Recurve Bow, probably shouldn't be an A tier or S tier because they're niche picks. They are something that is a little bit less conventional, and it's really nice when you see them every once in a while. But if you saw them every game, then obviously it probably wouldn't be a very fun experience. Next, we have the V9S. I think this also belongs in B tier. Again, it's one of those things that I think if you spend the time to master it, it can be pretty dang solid, but it just realistically isn't the best pick. And the main thing holding it back is its range while being a single fire weapon. Single fire weapons like the LH1, the Pike, the Repeater, these can all play at range, and that feels fine. But once you get up close and you have to single fire, it just kind of lacks a lot. And there's, again, tons of better picks like the shotguns or the M11 or the SMGs that kind of play a little bit better than this. Obviously, if you can fully auto this thing, if you can max RPM it while staying accurate at close range, then sure, the V9S could be a solid pick for you. But I think at the moment, it's just not that good. Now the XP, I'm going to put at the top of A tier. Now I don't think that this is S tier, but I think if we could make an argument for anything being S tier, it's probably the XP. And the thing about this is it is extremely versatile. And while it might not be the best in every scenario, it is pretty good in most scenarios, which makes it a really good all-rounder. If you're fighting them from range, it can do something. If you're fighting at mid-range, it could do something. If you're fighting at close range, again, it can still do something. And it is also pretty okay at breaking zips and trees. Like, it doesn't really suffer. Like our next pick here, the ARN, which sits a little bit behind it. Now, the ARN does have a slower TTK up close, but the further you go, the ARN actually starts to win, which is why a lot of people are kind of using this on light right now. And the meta, at least in the Pro League and in top high elo play, it seems like there's an even split between the ARN and the XP right now, and it really depends on the positioning that you have. Now, as you can see, around the 25 meter mark, this is where you're going to want to be using the ARN. It just dominates up here. So if you position yourself correctly, the ARN is really strong, but you're going to be forced into those close range engagements a lot of times. So I think the XP is a little bit better. Now, the ARN really sucks at breaking trees and breaking zips. It takes forever. And I think for that reason alone, the XP just nudges it out by a tiny bit. Now, thank you for sitting through this. You've still made it through here and you actually listened to everything. Thank you for actually listening to the logic and not just skipping to the end and then commenting below about how stupid I am, because actually in Power Shift, they were able to get 10 kills with a sniper, and it's not garbage tier. But this is for a more competitive ranked environment. And a lot of this is based on talking to a lot of the top players, some of the pros, and watching the Pro League itself and seeing what is strong there and what is dominating, along with, obviously, my own personal experience. Feel free to subscribe if you're not already. Thank you to my members. Comment below what weapons you use and maybe rank your own main weapon? Do you think it's S tier? Do you think it's B tier? What's your main and what tier do you think it is? And are you okay with that? Would you like a buff to your main or would you like a nerf to it? I'm really curious how people feel. Now, don't follow a meta guide to determine what you're going to use. Get out there and have fun with whatever you enjoy, and I will see you in the finals.